one of the places maybe we could start. You've got this book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? And I'm guessing, your experiences maybe similar to mine. In places like Oxford, often people are just going to assume that religion and science just have nothing to do with each other, right? In fact, I think you quote at the beginning of your book, one of your colleagues, Peter Atkins, the chemist, who says there's no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. So what's your response to that, right? Are there some sorts of things that are beyond what science can tell us? How do you think about these kinds of questions?
Well, this is a fascinating question. Let me say how delighted I am to meet you, Dr. Tuckett. And I massively enjoy this kind of conversation because we want to explore things that many people face. And many of my colleagues, interestingly, in Oxford are very sympathetic to a positive relationship between science and religion. In particular, quite a few of the professors in natural sciences. But there are some, of course, like Peter Atkins, who have a violently different opinion. And having had to debate him several times, in one hilarious debate you can see on YouTube, it's called Dueling Professors. And you can imagine what that's like. He hit out all fists and feet flying. And he is reputed for this statement that there's no reason that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. That's known these days as scientism. And the interesting thing is when you ask how I react to it, I react with caution because I'm aware that Peter Atkins is a bit slippery on what he means by science. And I think in that particular instance, he meant the natural sciences. Do they explain everything? But elsewhere, he seems to use the old meaning of the word science, coming from the Latin scientia, which simply means knowledge. And if you're simply saying knowledge can explain everything, that's almost a tautology, and I have no quibble with it. But I think he means the natural sciences, and I take a very strong issue with him. First of all, science and rationality are not coextensive. The discipline in which you're involved, for example, political science, history, literature, philosophy, theology, ethics, economics, all of these disciplines are rational disciplines. They're intellectual disciplines, but they're certainly not natural science. And if Atkins were right, then you'd have to close your faculty and many other faculties in every university on the planet. So it's a foolish kind of statement. And indeed, I'm a mathematician. I love logic. And the statement, science can explain everything, is not a statement of science. Science didn't give it to us. So if it's true, it's false. It's logically incoherent. And I much prefer the view of Sir Peter Medawar, who says it's very easy to see that science is limited. It cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? And what's the meaning of life? So that would be my first reaction to that notion.
No, that's really helpful. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So one of the things I think you do a good job of pointing out is there's times when we don't use our terminology very precisely, and we sort of assume things are in disagreement with each other when they're actually asking different types of questions.
Yes, that's right.
So what would be some examples of where, say, science and religion are actually complementary to each other, but they're just coming at a phenomenon at different levels of explanation?
I think that's one of the most important things we can discuss. A lot of the heat would be taken out, I believe, of the pseudo debate, science versus God, if we simply realize that explanation comes at different levels. And I often illustrate it by asking the question, why is the water boiling. Now, that is a scientific explanation in terms of heat exchange, agitation of molecules of water, and so it's boiling. But it also has a personal explanation. The water is boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, looking at that more carefully, the first explanation is really telling me how the water is boiling. The second explanation is why, in the sense of purpose and teleology. And as you say, these are complementary explanations. They don't conflict, they don't compete, they complement. And I've often said to people, the scientific explanation of the universe no more competes or conflicts with the God explanation than the Henry Ford explanation competes with automobile engineering as an explanation for the motor car. And if we could see that, I think it would help us greatly. I often quote the late Jonathan Sacks, a brilliant philosopher who was the former chief rabbi of the UK. And he put it this way. He said, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And that's the key thing. And of course, if we look at it, for most people, apart from the scientists themselves, the having a cup of tea explanation for the boiling water is much more important than the heat equation version, and has been so historically, because the bigger questions that the natural sciences cannot cope with are questions of meaning.
Good. So one way of looking at this would be, if we're trying to figure out the mechanics scientifically of a given process, right? There's a certain sort of questions, and any good scientist is going to be asking similar sorts of questions, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you see the automobile, you're trying to figure out how the engine works. The same basic level of physics and chemistry type explanation is going to apply whether you are aware that there's a guy named Henry Ford who designed this thing or not, right?
That's exactly right.
So what if somebody says, oh, okay, I see now. I think religion has only to do with the meaning of things, and science has only to do with kind of the mechanics of how things work. So they can't contradict each other because they simply are in completely different, non-overlapping realms. Is that right? Or do they interrelate more than that?
Not quite. That's the so-called non-overlapping magisteria view. And the difficulty with it is that those who espouse it, like the late Stephen Jay Gould, when you examine the small print, science deals with reality and religion deals with fairy stories and myths, and that won't do at all. I would say that, yes, in massively, for the most part, science will deal with the how questions of function, the how questions of mechanism and the why questions of function. It won't deal with the why questions of purpose. On the other hand, it may be a strong overlap in the middle, particularly when you're talking about origins. Let's take the initial statement of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, when you read that chapter, it's talking about physical things, earth, sky, water, animals, people, food, and all this kind of stuff. It's talking about the same cosmos that scientists are talking about. But it's saying things that are not necessarily accessible to science, but are consonant with it. I think the supreme example of that is the statement again about creation that prefaces the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through the Word. And taking that seriously, as I do as a scientist, I understand that to be saying that the universe is word-based. Now, science comes up with telling us that's exactly right, because it's word-based in the sense that it's mathematically describable. It's word-based in the sense that we now live in the information age, and we discovered that the heart of biology is coding. So word-based ideas are coming out of science, but science doesn't go as far. It's not capable of doing that as to tell us the source of that. which I, as a Christian, believe is in God. So you do get an overlap, and that's important. But by and large, 95 or even more percent of science will be done, and there's no reference to God or atheism.
So yeah, so there's significant areas where science is able to functionally in a way with a relative degree of autonomy, right, and vice versa. But there's also these areas where you would say doing good science raises questions about the meaning of the universe, about its origins, about things like that. And so they're not completely disconnected, right? Because there's things as we study science that give us reason to kind of consider things like whether there's like intelligence behind the universe and so forth. Well, let me kind of build on that and ask, right? I think one of the things that hampers having good conversations about this is maybe people misunderstanding what faith is. What are some misconceptions people have about faith that make it hard for them to see ways in which science and religion can actually complement each other instead of just being separate from each other?
Again, this is a key question because there's huge confusion about the nature of faith that makes conversation really difficult. And Richard Dawkins, I fear, is responsible for some of it, and so was Hitchens, the late Christopher, and Peter Atkins as well. And perhaps I can illustrate it by simply quoting Dawkins when he defines faith as essentially a religious concept, and only a religious concept that means believing where there's no evidence. Now, that actually is a good definition of what most people would call blind faith. But because he extends it to the whole concept of faith, he ends up in nonsense. Like, for example, this: atheists do not have faith, he says near the beginning of his book, The God Delusion. And yet that book is all about what he believes, what his faith and his trust are put in. So that's where the problem comes. And I find myself constantly insisting that people have a look at the dictionary to see what faith means. In English, it comes from the Latin word fides, from which we get fidelity, and that ought to indicate the kind of area we are in. And it is cognate with trust and belief. And if we have any sense at all, we don't normally trust facts or trust what people say without having an evidence base. And of course, that lies at the heart of science. Science is a faith-based endeavor, and it depends on the exercise of trust. We don't repeat all the experiments everybody else has done. We believe them. So I fear it has caused huge confusion, and it has meant that some people are clamoring for us to choose between faith in God and faith in science, as if the very concepts were at war with each other when they're not.
Right. So in other words, if we understand faith correctly, faith is a decision to trust, but we normally have reasons why we put our trust in things, right? And so, if we were to go back to the history of religions, the people who decided to trust in a particular reason have normally thought they had reasons for their trust, right? There were things that made this seem like a reasonable thing to do. So it's too simplistic to just assume that if it's something that's religious, people must not have reasons.
Oh, that's right. It's not only simplistic, but it's wrong. And I would like to just differentiate a bit. I can't speak for other religions here. Some may require blind faith, as Dawkins thinks that they do. But Christianity clearly doesn't, because in that same gospel I mentioned earlier, John, he explains why he's writing. And he says something roughly like this: Jesus did many other things in front of his disciples that are not recorded in this book, but these are recorded in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, John says, I have collected evidence, a collection of signs, of indicators that are the basis on which you can trust and have an experience of a relationship with God. So Christianity, by its own confection, confession is an evidence-based belief system.
Good. Yeah, yeah. And so like, yeah, even like throughout the Gospel of John, that's part of the main story, is recording people who are grappling with doubt. People encounter claims, and often some are skeptical, some are more inclined to believe. They argue with each other, and we're watching people in real time trying to figure out whether they have adequate grounds to believe something or not, right? So your point is that's been part of the Christian story from the very beginning.
And it's very important because the whole gospel shows a group of people who thought the idea that a human could be God incarnate utterly not only ridiculous but blasphemous. And what you've indicated in the way you put it so succinctly is that the whole gospel is a discussion of them coming to faith in Christ on the basis of the evidence that convinced them against their prior judgment. And that's exactly what it's all about.
Good, good. Let me shift our conversation back to science a little bit and ask this. So one of the things that I think people don't necessarily like grapple with as much as they should, and I think you do a good job of talking about this in your writings, is the fact that if we were to like graph the progress of science over the centuries, it's not been even, right? You know, there's periods where we see these like, you know, profound increases in the rate of scientific discovery. And one of the things people have tried to figure out is, are there changes in how people were seeing the world that made it possible for science to advance more rapidly? And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about like, what are some of the underlying presuppositions that scientists normally have that allow science to function well, and how those presuppositions match up with what Christianity holds to be true about the nature of the universe?
Leading historians and philosophers of science have noticed precisely what you've described. In particular, that there was a rapid acceleration in knowledge and building up science in the 16th and 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, and coming on up many others. And they also noticed that all of these people were actually believers in God, not all precisely the same theology, but all believing in a creator God. And that has been subject to a great deal of analysis because you see, Richard Dawkins once complained to me, and he said, of course they all believed in God because everybody did in those days. And I pointed out to him that everybody didn't. And there was no development of abstract science in China, for example. And I also pointed out to him that this was researched by a brilliant chemist in Cambridge who was a neo-Marxist and who wrote the definitive histories of Chinese technology. And he tried to explain this on the basis of Marxism, and he couldn't. And he eventually came to the conclusion, which C.S. Lewis came to, that the difference between the East, where you had technical invention like gunpowder and printing, but no abstract science, and the West was that the East had no unified concept of a cosmos that had been created and had regularities built into it that we could describe as laws of nature. And C.S. Lewis has a wonderful statement summing up the work of Sir Alfred North Whitehead, who was a notable historian, philosopher of science. And he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. In other words, far from faith in God being a hindrance to their science, it was the motor that drove it. So I think that's very important, and you can drill down into that and see certain things. First of all, the notion of a creator led rapidly to the idea of an ordered universe. And finding order in the universe didn't surprise people who believed in the fact that humans are made in the image of God. So they're rational thinkers, so to speak. But then taking that thesis further, and a brilliant book has been written about this not so long ago by Peter Harrison, who was for a time here in Oxford as the professor of science and religion. He said that an advance was made by the reformers who looked at the universe from a biblical perspective and decided that the biblical worldview was of a contingent universe. That is, God could make it any way he liked. So if you want to find out, you got to go and look at it. And the big transition from the ancient way of thinking, which was you make up your mind what the universe is going to be like and you impose that on it. So, for example, for centuries, people thought that all planetary and stellar motion was in circles, until you get to Kepler, who decided not to follow Aristotle, but to go and look. And he came up very rapidly through accurate observations with the fact that they moved in ellipses. Now, that's a seismic shift. So those two things, the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of contingency, made a fundamental seminal contribution to the rise of modern science as we know it.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it's this combination of believing that the world is rational, law-like, and ordered on the one hand, but also a view of creation, right? That views God as freely creating in a way that we can't predict ahead of time. Like, Aristotle's helpful on some things and not on others.
He is. I love Aristotle. Don't get me wrong.
He would be in complete agreement with what we were saying earlier about the difference between, say, the purpose for making a cup of tea and the mechanics of how the tea is brought to a boil, right? I mean, that's like vintage Aristotle. So he's helpful on that, but both he and Plato, I think, had this tendency to think, well, we can just imagine what a perfect world would be like, assume that's the world that's out there, instead of actually doing the investigation to see what the world is like. And so they go to all these links to try to prove that everything's moving in circles because they think circles are more perfect than an ellipse. But we as Christians would believe God is free to create a world with elliptical motion, right? And so we can't know ahead of time until we actually look at the data to try to see how God actually created, right? So that combination of both order and contingency allows us to have a kind of curiosity and open-mindedness as we try to figure out the underlying regularities in nature.
Well, thanks for rehabilitating Aristotle. I would hate anybody to go away from this discussion.
No, I'm a fan of Aristotle too.
Yes, and you mentioned his four causes are still enormously important.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with some of the atheists like Dawkins is they deny the teleological cause, which is the most important. But right. You're absolutely right.
Right. Whereas
so one of the evidence. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, often when we're trying to explain historical events, the purposes and intentions of beings who are involved is exactly what we want to know about, right? And so, Aristotle helps remind us that we only have a partial explanation if we haven't identified the purposes and intentions that people to bring to a situation.
Absolutely correct, in my view.
Yeah, so if I can follow up on that a little bit. I was just talking about agents and meaning and intentions and so forth. I think one of the other areas where science and religion sometimes end up at odds with each other is there is a particular type of scientific view that's very reductionist, if I can call it that way, and wants to basically explain everything in terms of physics and chemistry. Right. And one of the questions I have would be like, if we take that line of thought and we pursue it to its logical conclusions, what does that end up saying about how we view ourselves, how we understand what it means to be human, things like that?
Well, again, this is one of the core things that circles at the middle of this debate. And of course, it is a powerful thing to do methodological reductionism, to split a complex problem into simpler parts, to separate water into hydrogen and oxygen. But of course, what is at stake here is not methodological reductionism, it is ontological. That is, everything is nothing but atoms and molecules. Somebody once called it nothing buttery. And Dawkins has a wonderful statement of it. He says the universe is nothing but a collection of atoms in motion, and human beings simply machines for propagating DNA, etc. And that's like saying this Rembrandt painting is nothing but molecules of paint interacting with molecules of canvas. I think that if you take that view, if it were true, you'd never know it, as my colleague Keith Ward has pointed out. And many years ago in Cambridge, I was taught quantum mechanics by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne. And he, in one of his books, I think puts it enormously clearly. He thinks this view is suicidal. And the fatal flaw of reductionism of this sort is that thought is replaced by electrochemical events that are incapable of rational discourse, neither right nor wrong, but simply happen. And so, he concludes, if we're caught in that reductionist trap, then the very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. And the world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. And he concludes, quite frankly, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. And my main reason for rejecting this kind of physical reductionism is not because I'm a Christian, but because I am a scientist. And if I take a view of reality that undermines my confidence in rationality that I need to do science, then there's something seriously wrong. It would be ridiculous to espouse such a view.
And so, yeah, so in other words, there's a certain kind of conception of ourselves as beings who are capable of discovering truth that is put at risk with certain ways of viewing the human being, where human beings are nothing but a series of, quantum level variations, or however the science gets worked out. Somehow you have to be able to move from that level to some kind of acknowledgement of beings who are actually capable of assessing truth claims and weighing whether the evidence for them is good or not.
That's right. The problem here is that the reductionist, ontological reductionist explanation is demanded by atheism and materialism. You must argue bottom up. There's no top to affect top-down causation. And it ends up in nonsense. Now, what pleases me greatly is that some atheists have begun to see this and write about it, the most famous of which perhaps is your own Thomas Nagel in New York, where he writes a book. I couldn't believe the title when I read it. Mind and Cosmos is the title. Why the Neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false, or something like that. And he points out that there's something seriously wrong with the logic, because if you espouse evolutionary naturalism, it undermines any possibility of trusting in your rationality. And I often have fun in discussions with my fellow scientists, and I ask them what they do science with. And they say, well, I do it with and then they're not quite certain what's in there. They either say brain, or if they're more sensible, they say mind. But some people don't like the concept of mind. So I say, okay, you do science with your brain. Give me a brief history of the brain. And they come out with something like, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I smile at them and I say, and you trust it? Tell me honestly, if you knew that your computer that you're using every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I push for the answer. And I've never had the answer yes. It's always been no. So I say, you have a problem. You're using something to do science, namely your brain. But your explanation of the brain, your understanding of it, leaves no room for rationality. So I conclude that you're not only shooting yourself in the foot, that's painful, you're shooting yourself in the head, which is fatal.
So just to maybe make a similar point in a way that's even more specific. Like one way of thinking about it would be, if my conception of my brain is that it is the way it is because a completely unguided and random process that was merely selecting for the ability to leave viable offspring, more effectively than my competitors, right? If that's kind of the mechanism that has selected our brains to be the way they are, then we might have reason to think our brains are helpful for helping us figure out how to reproduce. But effective strategies for reproducing and effective strategies for discovering what's true could be completely different, right? There could be things I believe about myself that are false that help me in the evolutionary struggle, right? And so if the mind I have to make decisions with was kind of created, so to speak, or came about, I should say, it came about through a process that was simply trying to
maximize reproduction.
Maximize success in reproduction, I actually have a reason to doubt whether something that was, selected for that attribute also happens to be good at figuring out what is true for its own sake, right? So it creates this kind of doubt about whether I can trust my entire reasoning process.
I think that's an excellent way of putting it. C.S. Lewis saw this years ago. And he says, if we develop a theory that undermines rationality, it cannot possibly be true because we reached it by rational thought.
Right. Yeah. So somehow we have to proceed on the assumption that there's some ability of our minds, even if imperfectly, to track with what's actually true about the world around us.
It just could be, that Lewis is right when he suggests that the human mind is the first level of evidence of the supernatural, that we don't have to discuss miracles to start with, that the mind itself, because if you cannot reduce it in the reductionist way, then perhaps there's a top-down causation, and that gives you a direct path to have a consistent view that it is a created thing, that we're made in the image of God. So these things are fascinating to me.
Yeah. So how can, if we take religion and science and we combine them together, we mix them in your metaphor, what are some ways that allows us to have a richer view of reality than what we would have if we had only one or only the other?
Well, let me answer that personally. Just outside my window here, I've got a telescope in a small observatory. And I go out and I look at Andromeda with its 100 billion stars. And I'm fascinated by the physics of how those stars are born, grow old and die, and how the universe expands. But there's something else. There's a beauty in that. And that, to me, reflects the glory of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. And I wonder at that. And so it increases my faith and trust in the magnificence of God as creator. Or I love the science of the natural world, and my faith in the biblical worldview adds a major dimension to that, because I understand from the Bible that God has set me and the rest of us as stewards of that creation. So there's a meaningful cooperation. Peace be to people who think that Christianity is against stewardship of creation. Not at all, absolutely for it. And that gives strong motivation to look after the planet, its ecology, and all the rest of it. I'm also amazed at the discoveries of medicine, but medicine cannot tell me that humans are made in the image of God. And I'll not forget very quickly watching Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist and public intellectual, talking about Genesis. He does fascinating lectures on it, but he came to the statement, human beings are made in the image of God, and he stopped and he said, man, that's the heart of all civilized thinking. It's the basis of our morality and all the rest of it. And then he paused and he said, we neglect it at our peril. So that there's a consonance here. Science is uncovering the wonder, and God is the one to which that wonder is pointing. And it seems to me it's a tragedy to admire the planet and being thankful for it without knowing who to say thank you to.
That's great. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions. I just want to remind people at about 11:45, we're going to switch over and I'm going to start looking at some of the questions you guys have put into the suggest tab. So if you have questions you've been wanting to type in and haven't done that yet, you might want to. You can also upvote questions other people have put in, so we can kind of get a sense of how many people are interested in different topics. So let's try to make things a little bit practical. So, you know, a lot of what you're trying to do in your books and in your public speaking and debates and so forth is to correct some of these mistaken beliefs about science and religion that lead people to think these things are incompatible. What are some of the harms that come about if we get this wrong? In other words, if people have this mistaken view that science and God just don't mix, what are some of the implications or harmful things that come out of that misconception?
Well, some of the obvious ones are religious people being anti-science, even though they may benefit from technology. And that is a tragedy, because it seems to me one of the wonderful things of integrating God and science is that the Christian can do science and get involved in the scientific endeavor, especially these days when it is so necessary. And I encourage people to do precisely that they do the science and do it well, but also reflect on its meaning and how it fits into a wider picture. And then the other viewpoint is, of course, the scientists who are so enamored with scientism that they dismiss religion and don't realize that their science cannot provide a base for ethics. Now, that is really a topic for another discussion. It's a hugely important topic. But Einstein got it right when he said you can talk about the ethical foundations of science. You cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. Science can tell you what will happen if you put arsenic in your grandmother's tea. It can't tell you whether you ought to do it or not to get a hold of her property. And we live in a world where we desperately need an ethical underpinning, especially with the developments of artificial intelligence and so on. We need those ethical underpinnings, and science is not giving it to us. And it's very dangerous to reject religion in the name of science. It's fascinating. One of Germany's leading intellectuals, an atheist, Jürgen Habermas, says we need to be very careful before we try to get rid of religion. And I'm paraphrasing here, because it is the central source of meaning for many people. Not only that, he says it is the source. The Judeo-Christian tradition is the source of all the values that we count dear in the West and have done for centuries. And so I find it important to emphasize that legacy as a counteractive to the atheist hubris that is on a crusade to get rid of religion as if science and God were not compatible. I've often said to people, look, this is a complete myth that you have swallowed. It's obvious that science and God are not incompatible. For example, take the Nobel Prize in Physics. In the United States, Steven Weinberg won it. So did Bill Phillips. They're both geniuses. But Weinberg was an atheist and Bill Phillips is a Christian. That shows you immediately that the battle is not between science and God, but there is a battle. And I need to emphasize that the battle is between atheism and theism, and there are scientists on both sides.
That's helpful. I mean, I think I'll just say from my own experience, I've had a lot of conversations with college students where people are really struggling with their faith because they think there's this false choice where the only way to be a Christian is to abandon science, and there seems something wrong about that. And so it's often very liberating for students when they realize that, you know, that's a false dichotomy, right? That they don't have to choose one or the other, and they don't have to give up the use of their mind, the use of reason, in order to be a person of faith.
Well, I'm happy that you're having those conversations, because I think that is one of the most important roles we can play, is getting alongside younger people and showing to them that you can believe in God and you can enjoy your science to the full. You don't have to choose between them at all. And explain why people force that choice. They force it, actually, people like Stephen Hawking, because they don't understand what we mean by God. They think God is a kind of God of the gaps, an unknown X postulated to explain where science doesn't explain. Now, of course, if you believe in a God like that, you have to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. But the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's a God of the whole show, the bits we don't understand, the bits we do. And I feel we can render a great service if we can get it gradually, but surely, into young people's minds, that they can do science and love it and enjoy it and love God with their minds as well.
Yeah, good. So I tell you what, let's go ahead and switch now to some of the questions we've gotten from our audience. And the two that have gotten the most upvote so far are related to each other. And both of them basically are, I think, wanting to ask questions about the origin of the universe, the origin of life. It's sometimes I talk to Christian students who've grown up with a particular view of the Genesis story, where the assumption is there's a young Earth and a literal 7-day period of creation. There's other people who think, actually maybe God was at work in the Big Bang and the universe is much older than that. Where do you come down on those kinds of questions about the origin of life, the age of the universe, the Big Bang, things like that?
Well, that's about 3 questions, and I need an hour for each. But what I'm going to do is, firstly, a shameless bit of advertising. I've just brought out a second edition, just a couple of weeks ago, with Zondervan, of my book, 7 Days That Divide the World, where I go into all these problems from a factual perspective and also from an emotional perspective, because it's sad to see Christians fighting about these things. But I'm going to give you the briefest of possible summaries. First of all, it seems to me, when it comes to dating, the Bible actually doesn't give us a time frame for the origin of the earth or the cosmos. And that's quite easy to see. It's very interesting. And I've checked this out with professors of Hebrew from both Oxford and Cambridge, so I'm bound to have got the right answer. And if you look at the Genesis 1 text very briefly, the structure is simple. There's an initial statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then there's the famous 6-day sequence and the 7th day of rest. And the very interesting thing is the tenses of the verbs in those statements. In the initial statement, there's a past tense used. In the beginning, God created. In the sequence of days, there's a past tense used, but it's a different past tense. And the experts tell me that the difference between those tenses is that the first one, used in Genesis 1 verse 1, is describing an event at an unspecified period before the sequence of days. So the irony of it is that whatever you believe the days mean, and that's another question, and I have views in that, you can't deduce a young earth from it, because the creation is at an unspecified time before that. And of course, we have to differentiate the age of the universe from the age of the earth. And then we come to the question of life. Now, I know that's not an adequate answer. I'm just pointing out a brief possibility that may be new to some people. But life itself, the confusion over life in its existence, in its coming to be as distinct from its development, has been very profound. Because you often hear people say, well, it happened by evolution of the neo-Darwinian kind. But that is nonsense, actually. Richard Dawkins maintained that for many years. And he says that natural selection, the mechanism, the blind automatic mechanism, and I'm almost quoting here, that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and variation of all life. It's not the explanation for the existence of life, because whatever selection, mutation do, and they certainly do something, whatever they do, they can't explain life, because evolution in that secondary sense depends on the existence of life in the first place, so it can't explain it. And I was very pleased when Richard Dawkins admitted that. The origin of life is a huge mystery. It's almost equivalent to the origin of information. And I've written the book that we've been talking about, my new book, Cosmic Chemistry, goes into great detail of what's called the third way in biology, which is investigating the absolutely revolutionary ways of thinking now about the information content of the cell, and demonstrating that the neo-Darwinian thesis, as suspected by Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, is actually not rehabilitatable, but needs, in the words of a colleague at Oxford, Dennis Noble, fellow of the Royal Society, and who's one of the drivers of the third way in biology, it needs to be completely replaced. And I've tried in this new book to give some of the evidence that's pointing, in my mind, towards, and of course this is an interpretation of the science, even more strongly towards the existence of an intelligent God than ever before. So there are very encouraging new ways of thinking about all this stuff, which is breaking out of the hard carapace that's developed over the years, where Darwinism was the only game in town. So that's how I begin to approach that. And information theory is the way to go, because whenever we see anything, even 4 letters, exit on a door, we know that whatever natural processes have been involved in putting up the sign and creating it, there's a human intelligence behind it. And we need to draw that kind of inference. In other words, this is not science as defined by you must give a naturalistic solution. This is more in the spirit of Plato. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads beyond the materialistic paradigm.
Good. So you would say, if I'm going to try to summarize some of that, on the one hand, you would want to help Christians see, like one of the things I've observed is oftentimes when a Christian says, well, I don't actually think as a Christian I have to believe in a young earth, or I have to believe in 7 literal 24-hour days. There's this worry that we're like twisting or distorting the Bible to make it fit the science, right? And what you're saying is, no, actually, there's some of these things, there's actually really good biblical evidence, even independent from the science, for why we would want a different reading of Genesis that doesn't commit us to a young earth or 7 literal days of creation.
That's exactly right. What I want to do is take the science seriously and take the scripture seriously. And some of the fears and twists that have got into people's minds, in my experience, have been because they're a little bit afraid to look at the scripture square on and think through the various possibilities. And there's another controversy 5 centuries old that we've all forgotten, that in Galileo's time, most people believed that the earth did not move, but it was fixed. And they supported that from the Bible. I have not yet met a Christian, I don't think, who believes that the earth is fixed, even though the Psalms say it is fixed, that it should not move, because they've begun to realize that although you could interpret the Bible to say it doesn't move, you don't have to. And I would say, of the questions you ask, of course you could interpret Genesis as indicating a young earth, but I want to say you don't have to. And just as people came to a much more sophisticated understanding of the motion of the earth and it being fixed, not in the sense of geometric motion, but fixed in the sense of God building stability into it. Therefore, I think there's an approach that takes the scripture really seriously. I have a very high view of the inspiration of scripture, but doesn't make buffoons of us all by denying what seems pretty obvious from the scientific perspective. You see, we all use science to interpret the Bible. You cannot avoid that. It's our experience of the world that tells us a lot of the things and confirms what the Bible says, the existence of stars and all this kind of stuff. But I'll have to leave that for people who are interested to have a look at my own book and various talks I've given on YouTube on this topic.
Good. And just something else you said in your answer that I thought was really interesting is, sometimes I think in these debates, people have gotten so bogged down about like a simple yes or no on the mechanism of natural selection. Whereas your point is to say, no, we can actually reframe the debate a little bit, because even if we grant that natural selection is part of the story, you're wanting to draw attention to things like the origin of life itself, which almost, you're saying by definition, that has to be before natural selection, because natural selection needs life to work on in order to be able to select something, right? So you're pushing us to kind of see how a divine intelligence might be at work, even if some of the mechanisms of things like natural selection are part of the story.
That's absolutely right.
So if you were going to just answer the question in general, what apologetic arguments do you find to be the strongest? So in other words, for your faith, like what are the things that you tend to like lean on the most that help you have confidence in your faith?
So those are two different questions. The first is, what are the arguments that are strongest to present to the public? And that depends entirely on who I'm talking to. Some people will be convinced by one thing. I remember having a conversation with a very well-known professor of philosophy here at Oxford, and he invited me to come to his students, who are virtually all atheists. And he says, I hope you're going to use the best argument there is against atheism. And I said, I'll be glad to if you tell me what it is. And he said, fine-tuning. If ever I was going to be persuaded to be a Christian, fine-tuning would be top of the list. So there's an interesting confession from a self-confessed atheist. For me personally, it is varied in life, and my convictions have grown up. But I suppose the first thing from a scientific perspective is the simple fact that I can do science, that science can be done, that the universe is rationally intelligible. And that points, for me, directly to the existence of a creator. But I usually start with the even simpler account that I gave earlier of the history of science, the strong solidarity between the Judeo-Christian, the biblical worldview, and the rise of modern science. That is simply a fact that is acknowledged. And the best explanation of it is that the Judeo-Christian view, the biblical view, is correct. And I use those kind of arguments, but there's another completely different kind of argument. And that is the argument from experience, or psychology, if you like, that Christ made certain promises and we can test them. And that's a very key thing, you see. People often say to me, oh, you're a scientist. How could you possibly be a Christian? Because science is testable, Christianity is not. To which I answer, some science is testable, not all is. You can't test your theory of the origin of life because you can't witness it. But Christianity is certainly testable, because Jesus claimed that if people examining the evidence were prepared to face the mess they'd made of their own lives, and sadly, possibly the lives of others, and repented of that and trusted him, they would experience certain things. They would experience peace with God. And most students I know have a problem with peace. They want peace and harmony in their lives. They would experience a new power to live, and therefore a power to draw on, to resist maybe addiction to narcotics or alcohol. They would have a deep experience of God's forgiveness, and they'd enter into a new life. Now, those things may seem strange to some of you watching us discuss, but I've seen this happen many, many times over. Even as a result of discussions like this, that people start examining the evidence for themselves and they open their minds to the possibility and they ask God to reveal himself. And that happens. And it changes lives, and it's very convincing when it does, especially if people are in serious trouble and their trust in Christ, their conversion, whatever you want to call it, makes a visible difference in their experience. Now, if that were not the case, I wouldn't be remotely interested. I have lived with this since my teenage. It has influenced my marriage, my life as a father, as a parent, as a husband, and all the rest of it in our family, as well as, of course, my relationship with colleagues and my sense of the value and meaning in life.